Elvis Presley knew the world loved his voice, but his deep Southern drawl often became the punchline of jokes. By the 1970s, his fame had reached the heavens, yet the very accent that carried the warmth of Tupelo made him an easy target for ridicule among critics and elites. One evening, he agreed to a televised interview, hoping to speak about his new tour and charitable work. Cameras flashed, lights blazed, and millions tuned in, expecting the usual charm. But the host, smirking behind his notes, made a choice that would shock the nation. He mocked Elvis's accent live on air. Laughter rippled through the studio, the kind of laughter meant to belittle. But Elvis didn't flinch. Instead, in that charged silence that followed, he lifted the microphone and spoke. Words so raw, so dignified, and so human that they silenced every smirk, challenged every preconception, and reminded the world why his voice, on stage and off, was far more than a sound. This was not just a rebuttal. It was a revelation, a moment when music, pride, and courage collided in front of millions. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summer of 1972 in Las Vegas was suffocating. The neon lights of the Strip glimmered relentlessly against the night sky, reflecting off the polished marble of the hotel lobbies and the chrome edges of waiting limousines. Yet inside the Hilton, behind velvet ropes and camera flashes, another kind of heat pressed down on Elvis Presley. He wasn't feeling the artificial warmth of the stage lights tonight, nor the electricity of the crowd ready to cheer him into a frenzy. No, the weight pressing on him came from the expectations, those of millions of fans, of critics, of a society that adored him, yet simultaneously sneered at every trace of his Southern identity. Elvis adjusted his tailored white jumpsuit in the dressing room mirror, hands trembling slightly despite his composed exterior. The sequins caught the dim light, sparkling like distant stars, yet they did nothing to soothe the unease in his chest. His reflection stared back at him, a handsome face, confident, famous, but also a face that had been dissected by columnists, mocked by comedians, and caricatured in political cartoons. They called him the Tupelo hillbilly, the country boy with a gold-plated microphone. And they were not wrong. He was from Mississippi, with a drawl that rolled off his tongue in ways New York journalists found quaint, or worse, laughable. But to him, every syllable carried the memory of his mother's gentle lullabies, the scent of his father's old guitar, the creaking wooden floors of Graceland, the rhythm of the Delta that had shaped him before fame had claimed him. Despite the derision, the fans loved him. Down the corridor, behind the heavy curtains of the stage entrance, the roar of applause and chants drifted through the walls. Teenage girls pressed their faces against the glass, waving homemade banners, their voices rising in unison, reverberating through the hotel like a tidal wave. He could feel their adoration in his chest, a familiar warmth that had never left him despite years of scrutiny. But even here, in the sanctuary of his dressing room, he could not escape the whispers of doubt, the sly smirks in the back of his mind, the knowledge that a single misstep, one poorly chosen word or misinterpreted gesture, could become the next target for those who judged him as a provincial novelty, rather than the artist who had defined an era. The invitation for the television interview had arrived weeks ago. The network promised an opportunity to speak about his upcoming tour, his charitable endeavors, the projects he had quietly been funding to help underprivileged children in Memphis. Elvis, ever conscious of his public image, had agreed. He wanted to show that he was more than a voice, more than gyrating hips on stage, more than a symbol to be mocked in editorial cartoons. He wanted to speak as a man with roots, with heart, with dignity. But even as he prepared, he felt the subtle undertones of the media world, a world that had never truly embraced him, a world that often twisted admiration into ridicule. In the hotel lobby, the press assembled like predators circling a cage. Cameras clicked in unison, flashes illuminating the faces of young reporters eager for a soundbite that might ruin the man behind the legend. Producers hustled past with clipboards, adjusting microphones, debating angles, whispering warnings that the interview could get tricky. And in the middle of it all, Elvis remained calm, almost statuesque, yet every muscle in his body seemed attuned to a tension that no stage performance could mimic. He was a king in front of thousands, yet in front of these cameras and cameras alone, he was the boy from Tupelo, aware that every pronunciation, every pause, every laugh could be twisted into a weapon by the world that demanded perfection and mocked authenticity. The makeup artist brushed lightly against his forehead, blending foundation into the natural lines of his skin. He caught a glimpse of his own eyes, green, steady, almost luminous under the harsh studio lights. And for a fleeting moment, he thought of the irony. Millions loved the voice, the charisma, the dance, yet the very essence of who he was, his accent, his Mississippi roots, his unpolished charm, was mocked as if it were a flaw. And yet, here he stood, poised to enter a room filled with strangers who would judge him not on the music that had united generations, but on the lilt of his words. As he stepped out of the dressing room, the faint scent of cigarette smoke from the crew mingled with the smell of polished wood and camera equipment. The studio floor stretched before him like a battlefield. Bright lights suspended from the ceiling, microphones dangling like sentinels, and the journalist, a man whose reputation for sharp questions and sly humor preceded him, waiting just beyond the last row of cameras. The audience was seated, their murmurs rippling through the room, unaware of the private storm building in the heart of the man about to sit before them. Every step Elvis took echoed softly, a rhythm in perfect contrast with the chaos surrounding him. The fans' love, the media's sneers, the silent judgment of an entire culture, all converged in that hallway, and with a measured breath, he entered, ready to speak, ready to face the unknown, but acutely aware that tonight, more than music, he would confront something far more personal, the collision of fame, heritage, and pride. The studio lights flared as Elvis was guided to his seat, the leather of the chair cool against his palm, a grounding contrast to the tension that had been coiling inside him since he stepped through the dressing room doors. The cameras rotated methodically, capturing every angle, the tilt of his head, the curve of his smile, the subtle tremor in his fingers that even he could not entirely conceal. The audience, a mixture of industry insiders, television executives, and carefully selected fans, applauded politely, unaware that the real performance, the one unseen, had already begun. Elvis felt the familiar pull of attention, that magnetic force that had made him a legend, but mingled with it was an acute awareness. Tonight, the spotlight might not shine kindly. The host entered with the practiced ease of a man who had done this thousands of times, shaking hands, exchanging light jokes, and moving with an air of casual authority. For the first few minutes, the conversation flowed effortlessly. They spoke of the upcoming tour, of charity events in Memphis, of the energy of live performances. Elvis's voice, rich and resonant, carried through the studio, each word carefully measured, yet imbued with warmth. Cameras pivoted to the audience as they leaned forward, captivated not only by his fame, but by the humanity that seemed to radiate from him. For a moment, the tension eased, and then, abruptly, the tone shifted. The host, leaning back with an exaggerated smirk, repeated a phrase from Elvis's earlier sentence, but exaggerated, mocking the roll of the R's, stretching the vowels as though he were caricaturing a dialect in a children's book. A ripple of laughter coursed through part of the audience. Some clapped politely, others laughed openly, enjoying the cheap thrill of punching down at someone who had given the world song after song, yet could not escape being judged for the way he spoke. Elvis's jaw tightened imperceptibly. His eyes, green and luminous under the harsh studio lights, narrowed ever so slightly. Not in anger, but in measured awareness. He leaned back in the chair, still composed, yet every fiber of him felt the sting of a subtle, calculated humiliation. He could hear the clicking of cameras, the muffled whispers of production assistants, the nervous shift of feet on the floor, the air, heavy with artificial scents of the studio, cigarette smoke from an earlier break, the sharp tang of fresh paint, the faint perfume of the audience, felt suddenly oppressive. The host continued, pressing the joke further, this time asking questions framed to elicit more laughter at the expense of Elvis's accent. Every word was a calculated jab. The audience's laughter swelled, but it was uneven, as if some sensed the danger in underestimating him. A camera operator hesitated mid-pan, caught between capturing the host's antics and the subtle tension emanating from Elvis. Even the floor manager seemed momentarily frozen, clipboard clutched to her chest, uncertain whether to intervene or let the show continue. Elvis did not speak. He allowed the words to hang in the air, each one reverberating off the walls of the studio. His eyes swept across the room, calm yet unwavering, scanning the audience, the crew, the host, taking it all in, storing it, absorbing it, weighing every possible outcome. It was a silence that demanded attention, one that subtly shifted the energy of the room. The laughter, once loud, now faltered. Some in the crowd began to glance at one another, a flicker of discomfort spreading as they realized the depth of the moment, the undercurrent of cruelty that had gone unnoticed in the first round of amusement. The host, sensing the shift but misreading its origin, attempted another quip, more pointed, more brazen. Yet, for the first time, there was a tremor in his delivery. His rehearsed confidence faltered slightly under the quiet intensity emanating from Elvis. The microphone picked up the faint rustle of papers, the shuffle of feet, the subtle intake of breath from the audience. Every second stretched, elongated by anticipation, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Elvis's posture remained impeccable, his composure intact, yet there was a subtle tightening at the corners of his eyes, a slight lift of the chin, an invisible line drawn that no one dared cross. He did not laugh. He did not scowl. He simply existed in the space the host had attempted to dominate, and in doing so, he shifted the power entirely. The cameras, once following the host's smirk, now sought Elvis's reaction, capturing the tension, the quiet defiance, the poise of a man who knew that ridicule could be countered with nothing more than dignity. A soft gasp swept through the audience, unnoticed by the cameras for a brief moment, as they absorbed the paradox. Here was the king of rock, the embodiment of fame, facing mockery in real time, yet radiating control. Every instinct told him to respond in anger, to defend, to strike back. But he resisted. He understood something profound in that moment. The fight would not be won by raising his voice or matching the host's cruelty. The victory, if it came, would be quieter, subtler, and infinitely more powerful. And as the host paused, uncertain, the tension became nearly tangible, a living entity in the studio. Crew members exchanged nervous glances. Camera operators adjusted focus repeatedly, as if searching for a resolution that had yet to appear. The laughter from the earlier moments had dwindled into awkward murmurs. The host, for all his bravado, was suddenly vulnerable, exposed by the simple, undeniable presence of Elvis Presley, the man, the icon, the symbol of an entire cultural movement, who refused to bow to ridicule. In those minutes, the studio seemed to shrink, compressing into a space where only two forces existed: the superficial authority of a man wielding a microphone and the quiet, unyielding integrity of a man whose life had been built on voice, on presence, on soul. Every heartbeat was amplified, every breath deliberate. The host's smile wavered, the audience shifted in their seats, and somewhere deep inside, Elvis felt the first spark of anticipation, not for retaliation, but for the moment when he would speak, when he would turn this calculated humiliation into something that would resonate far beyond the confines of a television studio. By the time the director called for a brief cut, the room was heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. Cameras were lowered, cables shifted, assistants exhaled shakily, but Elvis remained poised, still seated, still absorbing. He had endured the first wave, and he knew, with the clarity of a man who had faced scrutiny his entire life, that the true reckoning, the moment that would define the night, was yet to come. The host, once confident and mocking, now glanced at him with something akin to uncertainty. The stage was set. The silence before the storm had never felt so alive. The studio fell into a heavy, almost sacred silence. The clamor of cameras, the rustling of papers, the faint murmur of the audience, all of it faded into the background, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Elvis Presley, seated under the unforgiving glare of studio lights, leaned slightly forward. His fingers, previously resting lightly on the leather armrest, tightened around the edge, grounding himself not out of fear, but as a subtle anchor in the storm of attention surrounding him. His green eyes scanned the room, not with hostility, not with defiance, but with a calm, penetrating clarity that seemed to measure every soul present, weighing their intentions and subtly challenging their assumptions. He lifted the microphone, a simple gesture, yet in that movement he reclaimed authority over the space. It was not just a tool for sound, it was a conduit for something far deeper: truth, dignity, and the voice of a man who had lived under scrutiny his entire life. The host, whose smirk had evaporated into an uneasy frown, froze mid-sentence, sensing that the anticipated rebuttal, a witty retort, a shrug, a nervous laugh, would not come. The audience, still caught between amusement and empathy, waited in suspended anticipation. Elvis spoke slowly, deliberately, letting each word linger, each syllable roll off his tongue with measured cadence. "This accent," he began, his voice low but clear, carrying both warmth and weight, "this accent is not a joke. It is my mother, my father, my home. It is the rhythm of the streets where I grew up, the melody of people who had little, yet dreamed much. And if you laugh at this voice, you laugh at the hearts of those who believed in more than wealth or prestige. They believed in hope." The audience was motionless. Even the host's eyes widened, the bravado replaced by disbelief. For the first time that night, the lights seemed to soften around Elvis, as if the world itself bent slightly to witness what was unfolding. He continued, each sentence building not in anger, but in deliberate intensity. "I did not choose this accent for fame. I did not shape it to charm the elite. It is mine because it carries the stories of people who sang when the world told them to be silent, who loved when love was scarce, who gave when there was nothing to give." The studio's air was almost tactile now, every listener feeling the weight of his words. You could hear the soft intake of breath from a cameraman behind the lenses, the gentle shifting of an audience member in their seat. the subtle click of a clipboard being set down too heavily. Every sound was amplified against the hushed power of his voice. It was not merely a defense of himself. It was an assertion of identity, an intimate testimony that transcended the immediate insult. "And yet," he said, his voice rising slightly with the subtle crescendo of raw emotion, "even if my accent makes some laugh, it does not diminish me. It does not diminish the songs I sing, the lives I touch, the love I feel. My voice is not a costume to be mocked. It is a legacy, a compass that points to where I came from and what I carry in my heart. If you choose to ridicule that, know that you ridicule more than me. You ridicule the courage of everyone who dares to be authentic." A pin-drop silence followed. The host, red-faced and struggling for words, tried to interject, but the words fell flat, awkward, impotent in the shadow of Elvis's calm authority. The audience, initially uncertain, began to feel a swell of connection, of alignment with the man before them. For those watching at home, millions of Americans tuned in, silent but captivated, sensing the gravity of the moment and reaching for their telephones in an instinctive need to affirm, to support, to witness. Elvis's voice softened at the end, not in concession, but in a quiet, almost sacred closure. "This is my voice. These are my people. And if my words, my accent, my story make someone uncomfortable, then I hope they at least understand one thing. It is real, it is honest, and nothing in the world can take that away." The effect was immediate and profound. The audience, initially hesitant, broke into quiet, sincere applause, which gradually swelled into genuine admiration. Even those who had chuckled moments before now faced the truth. They were in the presence of someone who did not merely survive ridicule, but transcended it, transforming a moment of potential humiliation into a declaration of unshakable dignity. Behind the cameras, the production team exhaled collectively. A few journalists, previously poised to mock, scribbled furiously, their articles rewriting themselves in real time. For the first time that night, the laughter of derision had been completely eclipsed by something more lasting: respect, awe, and a recognition of authenticity. Elvis's eyes met the host's once more, calm and unwavering. The man who had sought to control the narrative now found himself disarmed by a truth so simple, yet so profound, that no rehearsed joke or condescending smirk could pierce it. The power had shifted, not with confrontation, not with anger, but with a deliberate, heartfelt affirmation of identity. As the studio lights dimmed slightly for a commercial break, the impact lingered like a charged note in a symphony. Viewers at home would talk about this moment for days, weeks, and even years. This was no mere celebrity outburst. It was a declaration of human dignity, a lesson in empathy, and a performance that transcended the stage, the television screen, and the fleeting amusements of the powerful. In those long minutes, Elvis Presley had transformed what could have been humiliation into a legacy, a moment of unshakable grace, and an enduring testament to the courage of authenticity. The cameras cut to the host, his face pale and uncertain, a reflection of the reverberating truth now impossible to ignore. And in that silence, the studio, the audience, and the millions watching at home all understood the profound reality. Sometimes the loudest power is found not in ridicule, but in quiet, unwavering dignity. The moment the studio lights dimmed and the broadcast feed went live across countless living rooms, the effect of Elvis Presley's words began to ripple outward, like waves in still water. Telephone lines in homes across the nation began to ring incessantly. In offices, on factory floors, in diners and kitchens, the phrase, "This accent is my mother, my father, my home," was repeated quietly at first, then louder, as if people needed to vocalize their agreement, to assert their own pride alongside his. Phone operators, overwhelmed, struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of calls. Some callers barely spoke, choking on emotion, as they attempted to tell the local stations how profoundly they had been touched, how they had never felt so seen, so represented by a figure the world had once trivialized. Meanwhile, newspapers that had for years used their column inches to mock the man from Tupelo were forced to reassess their tone. Journalists who had previously penned scathing critiques about his southern drawl, calling it quaint or comic relief in the theater of cultural sophistication, now found themselves scrambling for new words, new angles. Headlines shifted almost overnight. Elvis Presley speaks for the forgotten, read one prominent New York Times article. Another, in a regional paper in the South, declared, "A voice from Tupelo resonates nationwide." The irony was not lost on anyone. The same press that had dismissed him as provincial and unsophisticated was now elevating him as a moral and cultural authority. Television studios across the country replayed clips of the broadcast endlessly, dissecting the moment for hours. Pundits debated whether it was scripted or spontaneous, but few could ignore the raw authenticity that emanated from Elvis in every syllable. Radio stations played excerpts, not of his songs this time, but of his interview, his words reverberating with a gravitas that transcended entertainment. The story quickly spread from cities to rural towns, crossing demographic lines. It reached coal miners in Appalachia, farmers in Kansas, shopkeepers in Chicago, and students in California, creating a sense of collective pride, a feeling that someone from humble beginnings had articulated what so many felt but had never been able to voice. Back in Memphis, at Graceland, Elvis could feel the pulse of the country in a way no studio audience could ever simulate. The quiet of the night contrasted sharply with the fervor his voice had sparked across the nation. Staff members brought in stacks of letters that had already begun arriving, addressed in neat handwriting or scrawled in haste, each one a testament to the emotional resonance of his declaration. Some letters recounted personal hardships, poverty, discrimination, loneliness, but each concluded with gratitude, a sense of hope, and, often, a reverent acknowledgement of the courage it took for Elvis to speak his truth. One woman from Birmingham wrote, "I've lived my whole life trying to fit in, hiding my Southern voice. Tonight, I feel proud. Tonight, I feel like I belong." The cultural landscape of America, already fractured by debates about music, morality, and social change, felt this shift immediately. Talk shows, normally focused on celebrity gossip, now featured heated discussions about dignity, authenticity, and the value of embracing one's roots. Music critics, who had long dismissed rock and roll as ephemeral and morally suspect, found themselves reconsidering their assumptions. The narrative that Elvis Presley was merely a performer, a spectacle, was being replaced by one in which he became a spokesperson for resilience and authenticity, someone who could channel the spirit of ordinary Americans into words that resonated profoundly. In homes where families gathered around television sets, children watched their parents' faces, witnessing emotion rarely displayed in front of them. Fathers who had worked long hours in factories, mothers balancing endless chores, siblings struggling with the societal pressures of the era. These viewers found in Elvis's voice a reflection of themselves. It was an acknowledgement that dignity was not tied to wealth, education, or social standing, but to courage, empathy, and authenticity. Even teenagers, often dismissive of cultural icons, were drawn in by the sincerity of his expression, the palpable weight of his lived experience woven into his speech. Across radio stations, newsrooms, and local diners, a new conversation began. One that merged entertainment with morality, fame with accountability, and voice with authenticity. People debated, argued, and discussed, but everywhere the sentiment was unanimous. Elvis Presley had struck a chord that was as deeply human as it was universal. This was not the fleeting attention of a celebrity scandal. It was the steady, resonant beat of genuine human connection. Meanwhile, advertisers and sponsors, often preoccupied with surface-level image management, scrambled to reassess their position. The corporations that had once considered Elvis a mere marketing asset realized that his influence had become something far greater, something intangible, yet undeniably potent. Aligning with mockery was now risky. Aligning with authenticity was imperative. The landscape of media perception had shifted overnight, and there was no going back. Even as the nation reacted, Elvis remained poised. In the quiet of his mansion, he did not gloat. He did not boast. He simply observed the cascade of reactions, letters piling up, calls flooding in, articles spreading across newsstands, and understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. His words had done more than defend his pride. They had catalyzed a movement of empathy, recognition, and respect. The ripples from a single moment in a studio had expanded into waves that touched the farthest corners of the country, reshaping the narrative of what it meant to speak one's truth unapologetically. As night fell over Memphis and the neon glow of Graceland's gates flickered against the humid air, Elvis could feel the stillness of his home in stark contrast to the storm he had set in motion across America. The quietness was comforting, yet it was charged with anticipation of the conversations yet to unfold, of the performances yet to inspire, of the voices that would carry his message forward. In that space between action and consequence, he understood that the true power of words lay not in their volume, but in their honesty. And he had just proven that to millions without raising his voice, without anger, without spectacle, simply by being unflinchingly himself. The day after the broadcast, the newsroom was a maelstrom of chaos and disbelief. The journalist who had so confidently prepared his jabs at Elvis Presley now found himself on the defensive, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His notes, once meticulously organized with clever quips and punchy one-liners, now lay discarded on his desk, a testament to the futility of mockery in the face of true dignity. Calls and letters flooded the network, some polite, many furious. The complaints weren't just from the general public. They came from sponsors, corporate offices, and prominent figures who demanded accountability. "We cannot be associated with ridicule of an icon," read one typed letter from a major brand, especially when the target is a man of integrity and influence. In the newsroom, the tension was palpable. Colleagues whispered, casting sidelong glances at the journalist, some suppressing smirks, others sympathetic but fearful. The hierarchy of power he had once wielded so effortlessly was evaporating before his eyes. Editors called him in one by one, their tone tight with disapproval, urging him to issue a formal apology or risk further backlash. He tried to maintain composure, but his voice wavered, betraying a fragility previously unseen. Each suggestion to redeem himself sounded hollow, a reflection of the deepening chasm between intention and consequence. He eventually appeared on a live follow-up, his tone rigid, rehearsed, defensive. "I meant no disrespect," he said, avoiding eye contact with the camera, avoiding the sincerity that had defined Elvis's response. The words, intended to placate, instead amplified the disconnect. Viewers could sense the dissonance, the lack of authenticity. Letters and calls continued to pour in, this time condemning the journalist rather than defending him. Social commentators dissected the apology, labeling it insincere, even condescending. "He's not the one in control here," one radio host remarked on air. "The audience has shifted allegiance. They no longer entertain mockery. They expect respect." The contrast between the journalist and Elvis could not have been starker. While the journalist stumbled through explanations, hesitant and defensive, Elvis maintained a quiet dignity, untouched by the waves of critique and outrage. He refused to comment publicly, letting the moment speak for itself. In press conferences and interviews, colleagues and industry insiders noted the calm, unwavering demeanor of the singer. He did not need to strike back or launch a counterattack. His silence carried a weight that words could not match. Every missed opportunity for the journalist to control the narrative only widened the gap, highlighting the contrast between shallow bravado and profound authenticity. Meanwhile, the network scrambled to contain the fallout. Sponsors debated withdrawing advertising. Executives convened emergency meetings to assess potential damage. They realized that the story had transcended television gossip. This was no longer about entertainment or ratings. It was about principle, about dignity, about a man who refused to be diminished by ridicule. The journalist's colleagues, once collaborators in a culture of wit and derision, now viewed him with subtle judgment. Even his friends noticed the change in demeanor. A tight jaw, a distracted gaze, a self-conscious awareness that each word he spoke could be misinterpreted, weaponized against him by a public increasingly attuned to authenticity over pretense. In contrast, Elvis's world was calm but alive with the undercurrent of influence. Letters continued to arrive, fan clubs buzzed with enthusiasm, and the public's response grew more fervent. His team monitored ticket sales, noting a remarkable spike in demand for upcoming shows. Records flew off shelves at stores nationwide. It became clear that the incident, rather than harming his reputation, had strengthened it. The audience did not just admire him for his voice or stage presence, they respected him for standing his ground with grace, for transforming an attempt at humiliation into a demonstration of character. This juxtaposition between the journalist and the singer became a study in psychology and perception. The journalist, accustomed to controlling narratives and shaping public opinion with calculated humor, was now revealed to be vulnerable, exposed, and ultimately irrelevant in the court of public sentiment. Each failed apology, each defensive statement, served as a reminder that superficial charm could never match the resonance of genuine humanity. The audience's allegiance had shifted irreversibly, and every misstep by the journalist reinforced the perception that he had underestimated the very people whose attention he sought to capture. Elvis, meanwhile, carried on with his schedule, aware of the unfolding consequences, but not reliant on them. He continued rehearsals, charity work, and preparations for his next performance, moving through each moment with serene purpose. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, there was a quiet satisfaction. Not in revenge, not in seeing the journalist falter, but in knowing that authenticity, humility, and courage had prevailed. The lesson extended beyond any one broadcast, beyond ratings or criticism. It was a testament to the power of remaining true to oneself, of allowing integrity to speak louder than ridicule ever could. By the end of the week, the cultural narrative had shifted dramatically. The journalist, once confident in his platform and influence, now faced the uncomfortable reality that public perception cannot be manipulated with sarcasm or wit alone. Elvis Presley, through a single moment of poised response, had rewritten the conversation, not just about him, but about respect, identity, and the enduring value of dignity in a society quick to mock those it misunderstands. In living rooms, diners, and offices across America, people repeated his words, shared the sentiment with one another, and felt a quiet pride swelling in their hearts. Pride not only in the singer, but in themselves, in their voices, in the truth that had finally been acknowledged. The journalist retreated into private reflection, recognizing that his role had shifted from provocateur to observer. That influence, when wielded without integrity, could evaporate in an instant. Elvis, untouched by bitterness, had converted a moment designed to humiliate into an enduring emblem of moral strength. In this quiet yet powerful reversal, the nation witnessed a rare and profound demonstration that true authority does not demand compliance, and that dignity, once asserted with courage, cannot be diminished by mockery. The night air in Las Vegas was heavy with anticipation, a mix of desert heat and the electric charge of expectation. The marquee lights outside the Hilton flickered like distant stars, reflecting off the polished chrome of passing cars. Inside, the audience waited, unaware that the man about to walk on stage had recently faced a trial of dignity that would define him in a new light. Elvis Presley had rehearsed all afternoon, his movements meticulous, every note practiced, but the weight of the past days, the broadcast, the ridicule, the subtle public scolding, hung over him like a shadow. Yet, as he stood in the dimly lit corridor behind the stage, he felt an odd calm, a readiness not of arrogance, but of quiet conviction. As the stagehands moved quickly, adjusting lights and checking sound levels, Elvis took a slow, deep breath. The sound of muffled applause from early arrivals seeped through the curtains, and he imagined the millions who had watched him on television only days before, whose support had now become a tidal wave. There was no anger in him, no desire for revenge, only a deliberate, controlled intention to reclaim the narrative. When the announcer finally called his name, the roar of the audience was instantaneous, a tidal surge of cheers that washed over him as he stepped into the blinding glare of stage lights. He began with a simple movement, sweeping his hand toward the crowd, and they responded with renewed fervor. Then, without a word, he struck the opening chord of "Suspicious Minds," and the sound filled the theater, bouncing off the walls, vibrating through the air, mingling with the collective heartbeat of the crowd. But this time, every note carried more than just musicality. It carried the quiet triumph of a man who had endured insult and emerged unbroken. The audience, sensing something deeper, rose to their feet, some with tears glistening in their eyes, some shaking with sheer excitement. Each cheer, each clap, was not just applause for a performer. It was validation of the respect he had demanded through restraint, of the dignity that had turned derision into admiration. During the first pause between songs, Elvis tilted his head slightly, smiling with that easy charm he had perfected over decades. "You've probably heard me talk," he said in his unmistakable Southern drawl, "but tonight, you're gonna hear me sing." The accent, once a subject of mockery, now resonated like a proud emblem of identity. Laughter and applause erupted, not of ridicule but of recognition, of shared understanding. In that moment, he had transformed what could have been weakness into strength, vulnerability into charisma. Every person in the room felt it, the sense that they were witnessing a man reclaim his voice, literally and metaphorically, and that they were part of this quiet revolution. The performance unfolded like a living narrative. Each song was a chapter, each note a carefully chosen word, each gesture a statement of defiance wrapped in elegance. His voice soared and dipped, carrying the weight of emotion and history, of personal struggle and triumph, of a Southern boy who had faced scorn and turned it into affirmation. The audience was caught in a hypnotic rhythm, clapping in unison, swaying as one body of shared devotion. Behind the scenes, his band watched in awe, knowing that this was not merely a concert, but a moment of historic resonance. Elvis was performing not just for entertainment, but to cement a moral victory over ridicule and misunderstanding. The energy in the theater was palpable. It seemed to pulse with the music itself. Elvis glanced briefly at the front row, where longtime fans had tears streaming down their faces, mouths open in astonishment, as if witnessing some transcendental truth unfold. The applause between songs was deafening, echoing long after the final notes faded. He felt it too, the undeniable connection with the crowd, the recognition that this was more than performance. It was affirmation. The ridicule of television seemed distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the immediacy of human hearts beating in synchrony with his own. Between numbers, Elvis allowed himself brief, intimate moments with the audience. He would lean toward the edge of the stage, reaching out to touch hands, nodding, acknowledging faces in a silent conversation that required no words. Each gesture reinforced the bond, the sense that he had not only reclaimed his dignity, but elevated the spirits of those around him. It was a mutual victory, a shared affirmation of identity, pride, and humanity. He did not need to strike back or berate anyone. The music and his presence had done all the talking. By the end of the night, when the final notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love" drifted into silence, the audience erupted into sustained applause that felt almost sacred. They were not just clapping for a performer. They were bearing witness to a man who had weathered scorn with grace, who had converted humiliation into triumph without a single vindictive word. Backstage, the crew exchanged glances, recognizing the rare alchemy that had occurred. A public figure had taken a moment designed to diminish him and had transformed it into a master class in character and composure. As Elvis stepped off stage, his skin glistening with sweat from the heat of the lights and the intensity of the performance, he allowed himself a private smile. He had done more than sing. He had spoken without words, made a statement of unassailable integrity. In the following days, tickets sold faster than ever, records flew off shelves, and media coverage, when it returned, focused not on petty ridicule, but on the undeniable resonance of his humanity. In converting potential humiliation into a celebration of authenticity, Elvis Presley demonstrated a rare and timeless truth. True strength does not need to fight. It simply needs to endure, to remain steadfast, and to shine through action rather than reaction. That night, the singer's Southern accent, once mocked, had become a symbol of authenticity and connection. Every note, every gesture, every look communicated the quiet power of someone who had faced the world's judgment and chosen grace over resentment. The performance was more than a concert. It was a moral victory, a cultural landmark, a reminder that dignity, courage, and artistry could transform even the most public of trials into triumph. The days following the Las Vegas concert were electric, but not in the way one might expect from flashing lights or the buzz of neon on the Strip. Instead, the electricity ran through letters, telephone lines, and whispered conversations across the country. Thousands of ordinary Americans, teachers, farmers, factory workers, teenagers, elderly couples, felt compelled to reach out, compelled to tell Elvis Presley that he had spoken for them when the world had tried to laugh. The letters piled up in Graceland, each envelope a small monument of gratitude, empathy, and recognition. Some were hand-scrawled on notebook paper, others meticulously typed, complete with heartfelt signatures and carefully chosen words. But every single one bore the same unifying message. Thank you for speaking for us. Thank you for standing proud of who you are. In small towns across the South, in cities from coast to coast, people spoke of the broadcast as if it were a personal event, a private revelation that had suddenly become public. Mothers whispered to their children that hearing Elvis defend his accent had reminded them of their own roots, of their own speech patterns, of the homes and families they cherished. Fathers nodded silently, feeling a strange kinship with the man who had turned ridicule into affirmation. Teenagers in high school hallways repeated his words like mantras, inspired not by celebrity, but by courage. If he can be himself despite the mocking, so can we, some whispered, and the words traveled like wildfire, a quiet revolution of authenticity. At one particularly packed concert in Memphis, the energy was nearly tangible. Fans waited hours outside, sweating in the heat, faces lit with anticipation. Among the crowd was a teenage boy with a worn notebook clutched tightly to his chest. He had come to witness Elvis perform, but more importantly, he had come to see the man who had defended what so many considered insignificant. The sound of his own home, the tones of his own people. When the lights dimmed and the music began, the boy, trembling, stepped forward to the microphone set up for audience interaction. "Mr. Presley," he said, his voice cracking, "thank you. Thank you for not being ashamed of how you talk. You make me proud of where I come from." Tears streamed down his face, and around him, hundreds of fans murmured, nodded, some openly weeping. It was a simple moment, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Pride reclaimed, dignity restored, identity honored. Elvis, standing on the stage under the glare of bright lights, watched the boy carefully. He lowered the microphone slightly, his eyes softening, a quiet smile spreading across his face. He did not rush into words or gestures. Instead, he allowed the moment to breathe. "Son," he said gently, his southern drawl clear and unflinching, "you don't ever have to be ashamed of who you are. Not your voice, not your family, not your roots. That's what makes you strong." The audience responded with a thunderous roar, not of noise, but of affirmation, of shared understanding, of collective pride. In that instant, Elvis realized something profound. The connection was no longer one-sided. The people he sang for were now his voice, echoing his message across cities, towns, and living rooms. Letters continued to pour in over the following weeks, each telling a story of personal struggle and vindication. A teacher in Alabama wrote that she had always feared her students would mock her accent, but now she felt emboldened to speak plainly, to embrace her roots. A postal worker from Chicago explained that he had always tried to hide his Southern dialect at work, fearing judgment from colleagues, but after watching Elvis, he spoke openly and proudly for the first time. These letters were not mere fan mail. They were testimonies of transformation, evidence that a single act of dignity could ripple through an entire society. Even the concert venues themselves became stages of communal acknowledgement. Fans would chant his name, but it was more than just admiration. It was a celebration of identity. Posters appeared in windows of local businesses proclaiming, "Be proud. Speak proud." The phenomenon was subtle, yet powerful. A nationwide affirmation that authenticity deserved recognition. For the first time, the conversation around Elvis Presley transcended music. It was no longer about hits, album sales, or the glint of rhinestones on a jumpsuit. It was about courage, about belonging, about the right to claim one's voice without shame. Backstage at Graceland, Elvis reviewed letters with his closest friends and bandmates. His fingers traced the edges of envelopes, feeling the roughness of paper, the weight of ink, the intimacy of handwriting. Each letter reminded him of why he had endured the broadcast, why he had responded with measured words instead of anger. The letters reflected a nation's heart, a mosaic of human pride and vulnerability, and as he read, he understood that his role had shifted. He was no longer just a performer. He had become a symbol, a vessel through which ordinary Americans could see themselves, their voices, and their dignity reflected. At subsequent shows, the interaction between Elvis and his audience deepened. Fans began to share stories from the letters they had sent, and he listened attentively, often responding with small, personal anecdotes that acknowledged their lives. The concerts became dialogues, a rare instance where celebrity and audience met not in awe alone, but in mutual respect and understanding. Even seasoned journalists covering the tours noticed the difference. There was a depth to the performances that had never been fully captured before, a resonance that transcended the superficialities of fame. By the time the tour reached its peak, the chain reaction of admiration, empathy, and identification had created a movement of quiet cultural affirmation. People spoke of Elvis not just as the king of rock and roll, but as a man who had turned an insult into a celebration of identity, who had transformed a moment of ridicule into a shared narrative of pride. Across the country, fans had become his voice, echoing his conviction, amplifying his message, and, in doing so, cementing the bond between performer and audience as something far deeper than entertainment. In these moments, it became clear that the impact of a single choice, to respond with dignity, to embrace authenticity, to honor one's roots, could reverberate far beyond the spotlight. Elvis Presley had not only sung to the crowd, he had spoken for a generation, and the crowd had risen to speak back, together, proud and unwavering. The first time Elvis received the call from the journalist who had mocked him on live television, he was sitting quietly in the sunroom of Graceland, a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, the southern heat pressing against the windows. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost trembling, a stark contrast to the arrogance it had carried months before. "Mr. Presley," the journalist said, I was hoping we could meet. I owe you an apology." Elvis, calm yet alert, listened in silence. He didn't immediately respond. In the long, almost meditative pause, he let the weight of the past month settle between them, remembering the letters, the voices of fans, the courage that ordinary Americans had drawn from his own measured words. Finally, he said simply, "Come to Graceland." The journalist arrived a week later, nervously gripping a notepad, stepping onto the manicured grounds with a sense of hesitation that seemed almost foreign. Elvis greeted him at the door, his posture relaxed, yet every movement radiated quiet confidence. He led the man inside, the mansion's walls bathed in warm afternoon light, the faint scent of magnolia drifting in through open windows. There were no cameras, no reporters, no audience, only the two men and the history that hung between them like an invisible weight. They walked slowly through the house, past framed photographs of Elvis in his earliest years, performing in small town halls, shaking hands with ordinary people, and smiling with a vulnerability that few had ever witnessed. They sat down for lunch in the dining room, a simple spread of Southern staples laid out on polished mahogany: fried chicken, collard greens, sweet potato pie. The journalist, fidgeting with his fork, seemed unsure how to begin. I misjudged you," he admitted, the words barely audible over the quiet hum of the air conditioner. "I thought I was being witty, clever, but I see now I was cruel." Elvis watched him carefully, the sunlight catching the edges of his hair, his eyes calm and steady. He nodded once, slowly, a small gesture that carried more weight than words could. "I don't hold grudges," he said softly, "but remember this. Words can wound far deeper than a weapon, and it takes courage to use them wisely. You had a chance to speak, and you chose mockery instead." The journalist flinched at the quiet intensity in Elvis's voice. He expected anger, theatrical fury, something sensational to write about. What he found instead was the measured dignity of a man who had transformed humiliation into strength. He looked around the room, noticing the subtle details of Graceland, the way the sunlight lit up a photograph of young Elvis with his mother, the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock, the careful arrangement of memorabilia that spoke of a life both extraordinary and deeply human. It was a world that refused to be trivialized, just as the man sitting across the table refused to be belittled. For the next hour, they spoke in hushed tones, not of music or ratings, but of responsibility, empathy, and the consequences of careless words. Elvis listened as the journalist recounted his intentions, his insecurities, the pressures of live television, and the desire to provoke a reaction. "I thought making you the punchline would make me clever," the man admitted, "but it didn't. It only made me small." Elvis leaned back, a faint smile curling at the edges of his mouth. "Being small is easy. Being honorable, that's the hard part." The conversation slowly shifted, from remorse to reflection, from explanation to understanding. Elvis shared stories of his own upbringing in Tupelo, Mississippi, of his mother's insistence that his voice should come from his heart, not his mouth. He spoke of the way he had navigated fame, of the moments when ridicule could have broken him, and of how he had learned to turn criticism into resilience. Each anecdote carried weight, each pause a lesson in grace. The journalist listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes silent, absorbing the wisdom not as a critique, but as a revelation. By the time lunch had ended, a subtle transformation had taken place. The journalist was no longer a man seeking to defend his ego. He was someone beginning to comprehend the magnitude of the lesson he had received. Elvis stood and walked him to the front door, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. He extended his hand, firm but gentle, a gesture that bridged months of tension and humiliation. "Go carefully with your words," Elvis said, his gaze unwavering. "They carry power you can't always control. Use them to lift, not to wound." The journalist left Graceland with a quiet, almost reverent step, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him, but in a way that felt instructive rather than punishing. For Elvis, the moment was a quiet victory, a testament to the strength found in restraint, the kind of triumph that doesn't require applause or recognition. He returned to the sunroom, sat in his favorite chair, and allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The world outside Graceland continued to buzz, but inside there was peace, a deliberate, hard-won peace that radiated from a man who had faced mockery and emerged unbroken, who had extended not revenge, but understanding. That evening, the news would report the meeting in tentative, factual tones. A journalist met with Elvis Presley in Graceland, an apology extended, a handshake exchanged. But the true significance would be known only to those who understood the subtle art of dignity, the millions of fans who had followed his journey, who had witnessed his refusal to descend into bitterness, who had seen, through quiet action rather than spectacle, how power could be wielded not through domination, but through mercy. Across the country the story spread, not as a scandal, but as a quiet lesson in humanity. In that rare, sunlit afternoon, surrounded by the quiet grandeur of his home and the echoes of a life lived fully and openly, Elvis had once again transformed an encounter meant for ridicule into a moment of moral clarity. The journalist had come seeking absolution. He left with enlightenment. And in doing so, Elvis reaffirmed something profound. True strength is never shouted. It is lived quietly, persistently, and with unwavering grace. The television studio was buzzing with the usual pre-show tension. Bright lights glinting off polished surfaces, camera operators checking angles for the 100th time, and stage hands moving cables in a choreographed frenzy. But this evening felt different. There was a hush over the crew, a subtle acknowledgement that something significant was about to unfold. Word had spread. Elvis Presley, the man whose voice had once been mocked, whose Southern accent had been ridiculed on national television, would be addressing the nation again. Millions of viewers, from bustling cities to quiet rural towns, had tuned in not merely out of curiosity, but with anticipation tinged with reverence. As the house lights dimmed, the camera panned slowly across the audience. Faces were a mix of excitement, wonder, and quiet expectation. Many were old enough to remember the rise of rock and roll from its earliest days. Others had grown up idolizing the king from afar. And in every pair of eyes, there was a shared understanding. This was not just an interview. This was history being made in real time. When the announcer's voice finally rang out, introducing Elvis Presley, the applause was thunderous yet somehow reverent, not merely for the entertainer, but for the man behind the legend. Elvis walked onto the stage in a tailored suit that caught the stage lights in a subtle shimmer. There was no exaggerated flourish, no ostentation. His presence alone commanded attention. He paused at the center, letting the applause wash over him for just a heartbeat before lowering the microphone. The audience leaned in instinctively, sensing the gravity behind the calm exterior. For a moment, he didn't speak. He simply looked at the faces before him, the millions of viewers watching at home, and allowed the weight of the previous months, the mockery, the criticism, the silence, to settle into the room like a tangible force. Then, slowly, he began. His voice, thick with that unmistakable Southern drawl, carried warmth and authenticity. "You know, my mama used to say," he started, a gentle smile touching his lips, "that a voice should come from your heart, not just your mouth. And I've carried that with me all my life." There was a pause as he let the words sink in. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing the room entirely on him. "Some folks have laughed at the way I speak. Some have said my accent is funny or unrefined. But I can tell you this. Every word I say comes from a place of truth, of where I'm from and who I am." The camera cut to close-ups of the audience, faces flushed, some with tears, others nodding, some clasping hands together as if in silent prayer. Across America, viewers leaned forward, entranced, captivated by the rare sincerity that seemed to radiate from the television screen itself. Elvis continued, his voice steady, deliberate, and imbued with quiet authority. "I may sound a little country, a little Southern, maybe even a little silly to some. But when I sing, it's love I'm sharing. And if love can make you laugh, then I'm glad I've brought you that." The words, simple yet profound, hung in the air. There was no need for dramatic gestures or theatrical flair. The power was in the honesty, the unpretentious dignity of a man who had been humiliated yet chosen to rise above it. For a brief moment, the studio was silent, save for the soft hum of the microphones picking up the resonance of his voice. Even the crew, who had seen countless performances, were struck by the gravity of the statement. It wasn't entertainment. It was revelation. Elvis went on, recounting stories from his childhood in Tupelo, tales of his mother teaching him that courage is shown not in defiance, but in integrity. He spoke of the letters he had received from ordinary Americans, from teenagers to grandparents, who had been emboldened by his words and example. "They reminded me," he said, voice tinged with emotion, "that what we say, how we carry ourselves, leaves a mark on the world, sometimes bigger than we can ever know. And if my voice, my accent, can remind someone of home, of family, of the strength they didn't know they had, then every laugh at my expense is worth it." By the time he finished, the audience erupted, not in chaotic cheering, but in a sustained, heartfelt ovation. People stood slowly, almost reverently, clapping not for a performance, but for the man himself. Across living rooms and kitchen tables, viewers felt the weight of what had transpired. They had witnessed not a rebuttal, not a spectacle, but the quiet, unassailable triumph of character over ridicule. For millions, the moment crystallized a lesson that transcended music, fame, or television. Dignity, when wielded with humility and courage, can silence even the loudest mockery. The final words resonated long after they were spoken. "I may sound a little country, but my heart is all of this country. And when I sing, it's for all of you. And if love, in any form, makes you laugh, then I'm proud to have made you smile." He lowered the microphone slowly, looked out at the audience, and for the first time in the show, allowed himself a relaxed, genuine smile. Cameras lingered on his face, capturing every subtle flicker of emotion, every quiet gleam in his eyes. There was no fanfare, no exaggerated gestures, only the enduring power of sincerity. For the nation, it was a revelation. Talk shows, newspapers, and radio programs replayed the interview in excerpts, highlighting not the mockery of the past, but the profound clarity of Elvis's words. Letters poured in from across the country, thousands expressing gratitude, admiration, and newfound understanding. And in living rooms from coast to coast, people paused, reflecting on what had truly been achieved. A man, once derided for his voice, had transformed laughter into love, ridicule into respect, and had, in doing so, reaffirmed the timeless truth that the deepest impact comes not from spectacle, but from the quiet, steady integrity of the human heart. That night, Graceland was quiet again, the echoes of applause and admiration distant but tangible. Elvis, sitting in his favorite chair, allowed himself a moment of introspection. He had faced mockery, endured ridicule, and had been tested not by the applause he had once sought, but by the silence that followed the laughter. And in that silence, he had emerged not just victorious, but elevated, a living testament to the idea that grace, courage, and love carry a power far beyond the fleeting judgments of the world. The final curtain hadn't fallen on a performance. It had fallen on fear, doubt, and disdain, leaving only the enduring resonance of truth, sung in a southern drawl, straight from the heart.